amazing how the commandment, thou shalt not kill, has been abused and misused throughout the years. I remember several years ago when a person tried to justify the animal rights activist slogans and different things that they do. He says, well, thou shalt not kill. And he applied it to dogs and animals and other things. And I asked him if he ate chicken. He didn't answer the question, but nonetheless, we've heard people say that. Or those that oppose the capital punishment will also refer to this particular passage and say, thou shalt not kill. Now we understand that that is from the Old Testament, but it's the word murder. And if you look it up in the dictionary, the word murder has to do with human beings. And it really has nothing to do with capital punishment or anything like that. It's taking of a life from someone else for reasons that are not good reasons to take that life. If the idea of thou shalt not murder applies then to the killing of all human beings, then we really have a lot of difficulty with interpreting the Old Testament when God sent the children of Israel into the Promised Land and told them to kill all the men, women, and children. So, it can't be a prohibition against all murder. But in our passage that we're going to be looking at tonight, we want to give a little bit of background it's really a review of last week's lesson, and then look at the text and try to figure out what Jesus taught in that. Now, a little bit of a review. Jesus declared the essential nature of the disciple in the Beatitude. And those characteristics, those 8 characteristics within the Beatitude, declare the kind of nature we ought to have. Then he also declared the influence of his disciples into the world, that we are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. We have an influence, and we must have a positive influence for good. But then he declared further his relationship to the law and to the prophets. He said, I came not to destroy the law of the prophets, I came to fulfill instead, he said. And then finally, he gave us 5 contrasts between the righteousness of the Pharisees and the true meaning of the law. Now in your paper there, you'll notice that there's a verse for that. It's verses 21 through verse number 48. So those are the passage that this particular thing refers to. Well then, let's look at the 5 statements in way of review that we looked at last week. The first statement is found in Matthew the 5th chapter, verse 21. Now, we're not going to read the entire section, but it begins with verse 21, goes down through verse number 26. But he began it by saying, ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, thou shalt not kill, and whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. Then the second one is found in Matthew 5 and verse 27. And it goes on down to verse 32, where Jesus said, ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, thou shalt not commit adultery. The third one is found in verse 33. He began that particular section. It goes on down to verse 37. And he said, again, ye have heard that it hath been said by them of old time, thou shalt not forswear thyself, but shalt perform unto the Lord thine oaths. The fourth one is verse number 38, where it concerns an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But Jesus said in that entire verse, and it goes on down to verse 42, he said, ye have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Then in verse 43 is the last one. It goes through verse number 48. He said, ye have heard that it hath been said, thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate thine enemy. Now in this lesson, we are concerned with the section of verses 21 through verse 26, and we'll look at this particular passage and then look at some different ideas found within it. Now in this passage, Jesus said, ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, thou shalt not kill, and whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. But I say unto you that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whosoever shall say to his brother, Raca, shall be in danger of the council. But whosoever shall say, Thou fool, shall be in danger of hell fire. Therefore, if thou bring thy gift to the altar, and there rememberest that thy brother hath aught against thee, leave there thy gift before the altar, and go thy way. First be reconciled to thy brother, and then come and offer thy gift. Agree with thine adversary quickly, whilst thou art in the way with him, lest at any time the adversary deliver thee to the judge, and the judge deliver thee to the officer, and thou be cast into prison. Verily I say unto thee, thou shalt by no means come out thence, till thou hast paid the uttermost farthing. Now, in consideration of this particular passage, the Pharisees had weakened the law in a lot of different ways. They weakened the law by their interpretation of it. They weakened the law by coupling it with another statement. You've heard that it hath been said, Thou shalt not kill, and whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. So they coupled it with, Thou shalt not kill, with whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. But what that really did is made the commandment simply a prohibition against murder. Now Jesus, he taught more than just that. He taught the commandment was more than just simply or merely a prohibition against murder. It was more than just that. He taught the spirit of the law and not the exact meaning of the law. So, by interpretation, the law was set in such fashion. They thought that they could keep it perfectly if we boiled it down and made it into simply a prohibition against murder. Now, Paul's a good illustration of such. We're going to get away from the questions and also from the slides here for just a second. Now, Paul is a good illustration of such. They interpreted the law, remember, as merely a prohibition. Well, when you make it simply a prohibition and nothing more than that, whether you're talking about murder or whether you're talking about adultery or whatever it might be, when you make it into simply a prohibition of those things, can we not live perfectly? Well, yeah. I mean, that's the whole point, and that's the point that Jesus made in this. There were more to the law than just simply the prohibition against murder or adultery or forswearing or whatever it might be. Well, like I said, Paul made a good point. In Philippians, the 3rd chapter, verses 4 through 6, Paul said, and he was really combating the Jews who thought that they could live perfectly by this. He said, Though I might have confidence in the flesh, if any other man thinketh that he hath whereof he might trust in the flesh, I more. Circumcised the 8th day of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, and Hebrew of Hebrews, as touching the law, a Pharisee. Concerning zeal, persecuting the church, touching the righteousness which is in the law, blameless. Now, did Paul live a true blameless life? Well, no. But if you boil it down to nothing more than the prohibitions, then a lot of people live a blameless life. I think about one of the first Bible studies I had. It was down in Louisiana. That is private type Bible studies. And I don't know that it was the absolute first one, but the first one that I remember that actually was interested in obeying the gospel. Now, she did not obey the gospel, but she was at least interested in doing such. And I think I've illustrated this particular thing with her before, but when I asked her if she sinned, she said, oh, no. But what she was thinking about is the 10 Commandments and those things that we're talking about here. She thought thou shalt not kill was simply a prohibition against murder. She thought thou shalt not commit adultery was simply a prohibition against adultery, etc., etc. And it's very clear that she saw it as these prohibitions rather than the spirit of the law as we're going to look at now. This was also the attitude of the rich young ruler. In Matthew, the 19th chapter, verses 16 through verse 22, Matthew recorded, and behold, one came and said unto him, talking about this rich young ruler came to Jesus and said to Jesus, Good Master, what good thing shall I do that I may have eternal life? And he said unto him, Why callest me good? There is none good but one, that is God. But if thou wilt enter into life, keep the commandments. He saith unto him, Which? Jesus said, Thou shalt do no murder, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, honor thy father and mother, and thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And the young man saith unto him, now notice, all these things have I kept from my youth up. He had taken the law and he narrowed it down to those strict prohibitions, and he said, I've kept all those commandments. And then he asked the question, what lack I yet? Jesus said unto him, If thou wilt be perfect, go and sell what thou hast, and give to the poor, and thou shalt have treasures in heaven, and come and follow me. But when the young man heard that saying, he went away sorrowfully, for he had great possessions. You see, this rich young ruler had boiled the law down to nothing more than prohibitions against evil, prohibitions against those basic things. Well, this is the attitude that was displayed in the Pharisees' prayer. Remember, he lifted up his hands. He stood and prayed with himself. God, I thank thee that I am not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. This is Luke 18, verse 11. Now that's what this Pharisee was thinking. He was thinking, I'm better than all these because I've kept myself according to the law, when it was more than just that. In light of this, then, let's consider what Jesus taught. Now, let's turn our attention to the first point, that is the true spirit of the law. And I take this from verse number 22. And to remind us, I put it back on the screen there. But I say unto you, that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whosoever shall say to his brother, Raca, shall be in danger of the council. But whosoever shall say, Thou fool, shall be in danger of hell fire. Well, you see, in this particular verse, not only must a person not kill, but Jesus went on to teach that the law really was about the disciple not being angry with his brother without a cause. Now, I think without a cause is the key of this whole verse, that we have to be careful with our anger. Being angry without a cause demands the same punishment as killing a brother. Well, the feeling of hatred and enmity and anger are equal to murder in the eyes of God. And John actually brings that out in the book of 1 John. And like feelings of resentment, which produce the same guilt as murder as far as God is concerned. But then we also find that not only must a person not kill, a disciple must not use expressions of contentment such as raca. Now the term raca simply means worthless fellow. That's all it means. But it's an expression of contentment. And such expressions really reveal the attitude behind it. It displays an attitude. This is just an example. Do we use other expressions that would show that same contentment for others? Well, yeah. I've always found it interesting that people won't use the term raca because of what Jesus said in this passage, but then they'll turn around and call someone else another name. Well, it's not a matter of not using that expression. And in fact, if that's the way we look at this particular passage as a prohibition against the use of the word raca, then we have lowered ourselves to the same standard the Pharisees did with the prohibition against murder. Well, then we also find that not only must a person not kill, a disciple must not use abusive expressions such as "thou fool." Now, "thou fool" stands again as an example. He's not talking about this being the only example of an abusive expression. We've all had different people to use abusive expressions against us. The hateful, bitter heart expresses itself with terms such as this. In fact, in Matthew, the 12th chapter, verse 34, he said, "Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaketh." So it's really more than just that. But again, we must put it back in context. It has to be with reference to, without a cause. Are there occasions in which people do things that show themselves to be a fool? Yes, there are. And the expression that they are being foolish or are fools, then there's nothing wrong with that. It's not without a cause. It's using those expressions without a cause. You know, we've all had situations in driving, and somebody does something foolish. Well, you know, we might say, well, that was a pretty foolish thing to do, or that was a kind of foolish, or something like that, or we might even use something stronger than that. I used to use the term bozo. The kids will attest to that. And but, you know, it's not without a cause. People do act like bozos sometimes. That's not really the problem. And even today, on the way home from services, we were on the way home through the old highway, and this young kid, he speeds up. I'm going the speed limit, and he gets literally within, well, I couldn't even see his headlights. I mean, he had his running lights on, but I couldn't even see his headlights when the running lights were below him. He wasn't even within, he was within an easy car lane. And I thought, you need to back off. And after a while, I finally got tired of it, and I slowed down and kept slowing down and kept slowing down, and he took off around me, just not too far from Shell and Chris's house. And so he speeds up, and the car behind him comes around me as well. And I just kind of shook my head, and maybe even used the expression. I don't remember whether I did or not. But he gets up to the stoplight, and then he was a half a mile ahead of me, but he set the timer, and by the time I got to the stoplight, I was right behind them, and we turned at the same time. Well, you know, people do act like fools. And if this was a prohibition against the term fool, then Jesus violated his own prohibition. You remember when he talked about the man that built barns and greater barns? And he said, "Thou fool, this night thy soul is required of thee." You see, Jesus violated his own. That's Luke 12 and verse 20. Even Paul violated that. I mean, if you call someone foolish or something that they did foolish, then it's the same thing as calling them a fool. Well, you remember when he wrote to the Galatians? And he said, "O foolish Galatians." Now, why were they being foolish? Because they were drifting back into the world and back into Judaism. Well, there are a number of occasions, and I always think about, well, I for years have called April 1st, April Fool's Day, the atheist holiday, because the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Atheists are fools, and there are reasons why God called him a fool. So did God violate his own terms? Well, of course not. It's not against the use of those terms. It's against the use of those terms and being so abusive and expressing those without a cause. Sometimes we need to recognize it needs to be expressed in order for somebody to wake up to their lives. Well, that fool stands as an example of this. So does this mean that anger is always wrong? And I've heard different people say that. But, Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 26 makes it very clear that anger is not always wrong. In Ephesians 4 verse 26, Paul wrote, "Be ye angry, and sin not. Let not the sun go down upon thy wrath." And then we look at different examples. God was sometimes angry, and is sometimes angry. In Hebrews 12 and verse 29, which is actually a quote from Moses in Deuteronomy, he said, "For our God is a consuming fire." In Romans chapter 1 and verse 8, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth of God in unrighteousness." And in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, many of us remember verse 10, "For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive of the things done in his body, whether it be good or bad." But in verse number 11, he says, "Knowing therefore the terror of the Lord, we persuade men, but we are manifest unto God, and I trust also are made manifest in your conscience." We also know that Jesus was angry at different times. An example of that is when he drove out the money changers. We get these pictures within our mind that Jesus was always happy, or that Jesus was a person that was never angry. But you really think when he drove out those money changers that he was happy? Do you really think that he was serious about what he was doing? He was angry because they had turned the temple of God into a den of thieves and robbers? You see, he was angry. He drove them out. And he didn't just simply turn over the tables of the money changers, but he actually drove them out. Or another example is in Matthew 23, in that discourse concerning the scribes, the Pharisees, and he referred to them as being blind and being hypocrites. You think he was happy about that situation? Do you think he was angry with those Pharisees that were leading people astray? Or when he told the people that they were fools and slow of heart. Now notice the word that he used there. They were fools and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Luke 23 or Luke 24 and verse number 25. Hatred then must be kept in its right place. In other words, what I'm saying is when we allow hatred or anger to go unchecked, then that's when it becomes sin. When anger becomes wrath and it goes without keeping it under control, then it becomes sin. So we must funnel it in the right direction. We must hate sin and evil, but we also must love the sinner. Remember, God hates evil. And the holier that we become, or the more godlike that we become, the more we will hate sin, and the more we will love the sinner. Anger must be kept then in the rightful place. In Ephesians 4 and verse 31, Paul wrote, "Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you, and all malice." In James 1 verses 19 and 20, and I refer to this oftentimes as the speed limit of the Christian. He said, "Wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath. For the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God." And it's a good place here to point out and to to remember that the difference between anger and wrath is anger is a feeling within. Wrath is the display of that anger. And so we need to keep that anger funneled in the right direction so that it does not turn into wrath, because, as James said, the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God. In Psalm 37 and verse 8, he said, cease from anger and forsake wrath. Fret not thyself in any wise to do evil. And so, as we made the point in the beginning, in verse 22, is the true spirit of the law. The spirit of the law is not just simply a prohibition against murder. It's a prohibition against hatred and expressions of hatred. But then we also note that we need to maintain the true spirit of the law. And in order to maintain it, actions then must be taken. And so let's look at some actions that must be taken. In verses 23 and 24, Jesus said, therefore, if thou bring thy gift to the altar, and there rememberest that thy brother hath aught against thee, leave there thy gift before the altar, and go thy way. First be reconciled to thy brother, and then come and offer thy gift. Well, disciples must take positive steps in order to remove hatred. And that's what those verses really were about. We need to take those positive steps, and it begins with, while worshiping, you remember that your brother has something against you. Now notice how Jesus talked about this. It's not you remember that you have done something against your brother, which hopefully all of us have corrected those kind of actions, but it's the statement that Jesus said, you remember that your brother hath aught against you. So what are we to do? Well, Jesus then gave us those positive steps. First, we need to leave the gift at the altar and then go to your brother for the purpose of reconciliation. Now, it's very clear that Jesus had reconciliation in mind. And so we leave the gift at the altar and we go to that brother to make reconciliation. Now, there's very clear that sometimes a brother will go to another brother or a sister to another sister, and they have no hope of reconciliation. And they have no intent of reconciliation. They're not willing to do what's necessary in order to bring about reconciliation. And so they go with no intent to bring it about. Some go for the purpose of justifying themselves. Well, I'm going to go there and I'm going to let them know exactly how I stand and where I'm right in this matter. They don't go with the purpose of reconciliation. They go to make themselves look right. That's not the right reason to go. And then some go for the purpose of condemning the brother. Oh, I just can't hardly wait. He's done something wrong to me. And I'm going to go to him and I'm going to correct him. And I'm going to show where the error of his way. And so they go with the intent to condemn. They don't go, sad to say, with intent of reconciliation. Now, we know all kinds of situations like that. The scenario's not right. The heart's not right. We need to go with the intent of reconciliation. And then afterwards, we come and then offer our gift. Now, the offering of the gift in this passage is worship. And so before we worship God, we need to make things right. And if we have aught with a brother, we need to make those things right. In other words, it's not enough simply not to kill. It's not enough not to berate. A disciple must try to remove the cause of the trouble. The disciple must seek reconciliation. A number of years ago, I preached at a congregation in Missouri. And actually, it was preached about another passage that concerned reconciliation. Well, that congregation had divided several years previous to it. But there hadn't been any efforts for reconciliation in years and years to come. And one of the brothers of that congregation, he said, I'm going to have to make some more efforts in order that we can reconcile these two congregations again. And he did make some efforts. But, you know, when you look at all those kind of things, everyone knows trouble cannot always be removed. And there's several reasons for that. Reconciliation is not always dependent upon myself or that person who's trying to reconcile alone. You see, reconciliation is sometimes dependent on both parties that are involved. And in this particular case, the other congregation was not interested in reconciliation. They had no intent of reconciliation. But disciples must make every attempt to solve the problems that go between us, which includes going to the person and talking to them. Now, I've known different ones, and I think about different ones through the years, that they go to someone and says, you need to come to me and talk. Wait a second, that's not what that verse says. It says go to him. Or people will say, well, they're the one that sinned, they need to come to me. That's not what that verse says. It says you go to them. When you realize that there's a problem that exists, Jesus said, you go to that person and you try to make reconciliation. To approach the throne of God in worship. Oh, such an important aspect of our lives. But if we approach the throne of God in worship with a feeling of contempt towards someone else, that makes our worship vain and empty before God. Do you ever think about that? I don't want my worship to be vain and empty. In Isaiah 59 and verse 2, Isaiah said, but your iniquities have separated between you and your God, and your sins have hid his face from you, that he will not hear. I also think about 1 Peter chapter 3. And though this particular passage is about husbands, but the application is much further than that. In 1 Peter 3 and verse 7, he says, likewise, ye husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge, talking about wives, giving honor unto the wife, as unto the weaker vessel, and being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. Now just keep in mind that sometimes prayers is used as a synecdoche. We talked about that in our class this morning, where a part represents the whole. And in fact, I have a 4-volume set, and it's about this big, about the size of a Sears catalog each volume. In fact, the last volume is probably 1.5 times the size of a Sears catalog. And those of us a little bit older will know what I'm talking about. Those of you that are younger might not know what I'm talking about. I don't know. But anyway, it's a big volume set, and it's serious about word study. And the first definition it gave for prayer is worship. Prayer is oftentimes used for worship. And yet Peter said that your prayers be not hindered, that your worship be not hindered. I think that's the right interpretation of that. Now, is that only for husbands? I don't think so. You mean, and some people want to apply it that way, you mean if the wife does something and it's all right for her to do that and her worship is not hindered? No, that doesn't even make sense to apply it that way. And in fact, with the application that Peter makes to that entire section, I think it refers to any relationship that we have. If we don't try to make things right with people, our worship is hindered. David said in Psalm 66 and verse 18, if I regard iniquity in my heart, the Lord will not hear me. The last part that we want to look at in the last couple of verses is the true spirit of the law is one of urgency. In verses 25 and 26, and notice as we read through this, the different statements of urgency. Agree with thine adversary quickly. while thou art in the way with him, lest at any time the adversary deliver thee to the judge, and the judge deliver thee to the officer, and thou be cast into prison. Verily I say unto thee, thou shalt by no means come out thence, till thou hast paid the uttermost farthing. So why the urgency? Well, the first reason is because God is judge. 2 Corinthians 5 verse 10, which we referred to earlier. We must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive the things done in his body, whether it be good or bad. We're going to stand before that judgment seat. Now, when is that judgment going to come? We don't know. Years ago, I learned to do Bible studies from a series of charts that we used at that particular time. And I remember that last chart of encouraging that person to obey the gospel. And one of the things that they said is that you don't know when judgment's coming. That's the reason why we need to get things right. That's why we need to, that's the urgency behind making things right and reconciliation. And so because God is the judge. A second reason is because the law of God demands God's people to love one another. In John the 15th chapter and verse 12, among other places, Jesus said, "This is my commandment, that ye love one another, as I have loved you." We're to love one another like Christ loved us. Now, brethren, that's a pretty deep love there. And we must love one another in the same way. In Romans 13 and verse 8, Paul said, "Owe no man anything but to love one another. For he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law." In 1 John chapter 4 and verse 7, "Beloved, let us love one another, for God is love, and everyone that loveth is born of God and knoweth God." It is absolutely important. And I've just really gave a sampling of those things. I mean, we could look at, in fact, we could just read passages that deal with loving one another and spend the entire lesson just reading one passage after another. But a third reason why that we ought to love one another, or that we ought to make sure we're right with our brothers, because a disciple does not want to face the judgment without love for the brethren. It's not a good thing to approach that. Here we are standing before the Son of God, who gave his life for us. Now that's easy to understand. Hard to contemplate, hard to fully understand it, but we understand that basic concept, do we not? But do we also understand that he gave his life for all mankind, not just for me, not just those who are loving, not just those that want to do right, but also those who do evil. And we have to love them as God has loved us. I'm reminded of what Jesus said in our text. "Thou shalt by no means come out thence, till thou hast paid the uttermost farthing." Jesus said that reconciliation was to be done while thou art in the way. Now, while thou art in the way suggests that while we're walking down life's pathways, that's what that means. While it's in the way, while we're in this life, we're to do that. And so while walking down the road of life, let us make things right with one another. You know, in life, and in the church, sad to say, there is always some bad blood between brothers or between sisters. And I know that sometimes that cannot be helped. And I know that reconciliation is not always possible in such situations because of different things. And I think about another old gospel preacher, although Brecklin told me tonight that I was an old gospel preacher. But anyway, be that as it may, but I remember an older gospel preacher, and he said, "You know, I have fellowship with that brother, but I have fellowship with him from afar." And I understand that. But at the same time, also understand the urgency of taking care of that bad blood. It's not always able, but if we can take care of it, we need to. And there are always things that are wrong and that are needing correcting. And I think about different things that people say about, different things that, it's amazing what we can critique of our brethren. When in reality, we critique them of things that it absolutely does not matter. We need to be careful about that. And I know that I'm just as guilty as anybody else. But if there's something seriously a flaw and seriously needs to be taken care of, settle it at once. And a couple of exhortations from the Scripture, and then we'll close. In Ephesians 4 and verse 32, Paul wrote, "Be ye kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake hath forgiven you." In Romans 12 and verse 18, Paul wrote, "If it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men." But one other thing to consider with this. Jesus is our elder brother. And a good question that we have to ask ourselves oftentimes is, are you right with your elder brother? Are you right with Jesus? But then we have to think. A person cannot be right with Jesus if he or she is at odds with a brother or sister. You have to do everything within your power to make it right. Have you done so? Settle it at once. This evening we do want to offer the invitation. There may be someone that would like to respond to it. And if you need to respond to the invitation, whether to become a Christian or to repent of sin or to ask prayers of the church, the invitation is yours. Won't you come as together we stand and sing to encourage you?
There's a